Ghost Adventures has produced controversial moments across 20 seasons, locations that divided the audience, evidence that divided the scientific community, editorial decisions that divided the fan base. But one episode stands apart from all of it. The episode that produced more internal conflict, more external pressure, and more sustained silence from everyone connected to its production than anything the franchise has ever broadcast. Zach Bagans just exposed the truth behind it. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Ghost Adventures has never been a show that avoided controversy. The franchise built its audience on the willingness to go further than other paranormal productions, to document evidence that other shows would have softened, to present conclusions that other presenters would have hedged, and to put Zach Bagans personally in the frame of whatever the investigation produced rather than maintaining the professional distance that the paranormal television format typically preserves between the presenter and the phenomenon. That willingness generated controversy consistently, and the show absorbed it consistently. The critical dismissals, the skeptical community's systematic challenges to specific pieces of evidence, the occasional friction with location owners and community members who felt the production had not represented their spaces fairly. All of it was processed within the franchise's operational culture as the ordinary cost of doing what the show did the way the show did it. The controversy surrounding the episode Bagans just exposed the truth behind is different from that ordinary operational controversy in a specific and documentable way. It is different not because the episode's content was more extreme than what the franchise had previously broadcast. The catalog of Ghost Adventures episodes contains content that exceeds the controversial episode in its dramatic extremity without generating comparable sustained sensitivity within the production. It is different because the controversy surrounding this episode has never been fully external. It has lived inside the production, in the relationship between the investigation team and the network, in the specific decisions that were made about how the episode was assembled and what it contained when it was broadcast, and in the gap between what the investigation produced and what the audience was permitted to see. Every other Ghost Adventures controversy has been about whether what the show broadcast was real or significant or responsibly presented. The controversy surrounding this episode has always been about whether what the show broadcast was complete, whether the version of the investigation the audience received was the investigation that actually occurred. Bagans has been carrying the answer to that question for years. What he just exposed is that answer, and the answer changes everything about what the most controversial Ghost Adventures episode actually was and what it actually documented. The episode at the center of Bagans' exposure is one that the Ghost Adventures audience will recognize immediately, not because it was the most dramatically extreme episode in the franchise's broadcast history, but because its reception, from the moment it aired, was marked by a specific quality of unresolved tension that the show's audience has never fully been able to account for. The broadcast version of the episode follows the standard Ghost Adventures format: location establishment, historical research, the lockdown session, the evidence review. What distinguishes it from the standard format episodes that surround it in the broadcast record is a quality that the most attentive viewers of the franchise noticed immediately and have been noting in community discussions ever since. The episode feels edited in a way that the show's other episodes do not edited in the normal sense of footage being shaped into a coherent narrative. All television production involves that kind of editing, and Ghost Adventures has always been transparent about the production process that shapes its raw investigation footage into broadcast episodes. Edited in a different sense, edited in the sense of something being missing, of the narrative moving between moments in ways that suggest the connecting tissue between those moments has been removed rather than compressed, of evidence being referenced in ways that imply more extensive documentation exists than what the broadcast version presents, and of the investigation team's behavior in specific segments of the episode communicating a context that the footage surrounding those segments does not supply. The audience noticed. The Ghost Adventures fan community's response to the episode in the period following its broadcast was distinctive in the specific nature of the questions it generated, not the standard debates about whether the evidence was genuine or whether the investigation methodology was sound, but questions about what was not in the episode, what happened in the location between the segments the broadcast version shows, what the investigation team encountered during the portions of the lockdown session that the edited version covers in a single line of narration, rather than in the detail the show typically applies to active investigation periods, and what Bagans himself was responding to in two specific moments in the episode. where his on-camera behavior communicates something that the surrounding footage does not explain. Those questions have been present in the Ghost Adventures community since the episode aired. Bagans just answered them. The location investigated in the controversial episode has a documented history that the broadcast version of the episode presented in edited form, covering its most dramatically significant historical elements while leaving others either unreferenced or referenced in passing, without the detail that their evidential significance warranted. Understanding why the location was always going to produce the kind of investigation that the broadcast version only partially represents requires engaging with the complete documented history rather than the edited version the episode provided. The location's anomalous history predates the Ghost Adventures investigation by decades and is documented across multiple independent sources, whose consistency across temporal and institutional distance gives the accumulated record a credibility that single-source accounts cannot claim. The prior investigators who had attempted systematic documentation of the location's phenomenon had produced findings whose specific characteristics the Ghost Adventures research team was fully aware of before the cameras arrived. Findings that pointed toward a class of phenomenon at this location that was different in character from the haunting activity that the show's standard investigation format was designed to document and present. The distinction is important. Ghost Adventures has documented haunting activity across hundreds of locations across 20 seasons. The investigation team has developed a sophisticated operational framework for engaging with the category of phenomenon that haunted locations typically produce: the residual energy, the interactive intelligence, the physical manifestations of whatever remains at a location after the circumstances that created it have concluded. What the prior investigation record for this location indicated was present, there was not cleanly within that category. The specific characteristics of the prior documented activity, the physical effects on investigators, the nature of the responses produced during active investigation sessions, and the pattern of aftermath effects reported by people who had spent extended time on the property were consistent with a class of phenomenon that the Ghost Adventures team's operational experience had encountered in a small number of prior locations, and whose specific characteristics Bagans has always discussed with a particular quality of careful management that distinguishes his communications about this class from his communications about the broader range of haunting activity the show documents. The location was flagged internally before the investigation as belonging to that specific class. What that flagging meant for the investigation's operational protocols and what the investigation produced when those protocols were deployed in the location is the content of the exposure Bagans just delivered. The lockdown session at the controversial episode's location produced a sequence of events during a specific window of the investigation that the broadcast version of the episode covers in a manner that Bagans has now characterized as the most significant editorial decision in the franchise's 20-year broadcast history. Not the most dramatic editorial decision. The franchise's editorial history contains decisions about specific pieces of evidence whose dramatic significance exceeded anything in this episode. The most significant in the specific sense of a decision whose consequences for the integrity of the investigation's public record have been more extensive and more lasting than any comparable editorial choice the production has made. What happened during the relevant window of the lockdown session is what Bagans is exposing. His account of the specific events is the first complete public description of what the investigation encountered during that period. Not a reference to the existence of unreleased material, not a general acknowledgement that the broadcast version was incomplete, but a specific and detailed account of what occurred in the location during the window the broadcast version covers in summary. The events of that window involved a direct encounter between the investigation team and the phenomenon present at the location, an encounter whose specific characteristics placed it in the class of activity that the pre-investigation research had identified as the location's primary phenomenon. The encounter was not subtle. It was not ambiguous in the way that the evidence the broadcast version presents is ambiguous. It produced physical effects on members of the investigation team that were documented medically in the period following the lockdown session, and that the production's medical documentation records describe in terms that correspond directly to the class of phenomenon the pre-investigation research had identified. It produced instrument readings whose values the broadcast version references without showing the full data, readings that the investigation's technical records document as the most extreme values any Ghost Adventures investigation has ever generated across any instrument category. And it produced something else. something that the cameras documented during the encounter's peak intensity that Bagans describes in his exposure with the specific quality of care that he applies to the most significant things he has ever said publicly about what Ghost Adventures has found in 20 years of investigation. The evidence removed from the controversial episode before broadcast falls into 3 specific categories whose combination is what made the network's decision to cut them collectively rather than to address them individually through the standard editorial process of contextualizing anomalous evidence within the show's established presentation framework. The first category is the instrument data from the lockdown session's peak intensity window. The readings generated during that window across the investigation's full instrument deployment represent values that the broadcast version of the episode references in general terms without showing the specific numbers. Those specific numbers, the electromagnetic field strength readings, the acoustic measurements in the relevant frequency ranges, and the thermal anomaly data from the cameras covering the encounter location, are in the production's technical records and have been reviewed by people outside the immediate production team whose assessments of their significance have not been made public. What those assessments established about the instrument data is part of what Bagans is exposing. The second category is footage from the lockdown session itself, specific segments of the camera coverage that captured the encounter's development and whose visual content the network's editorial review determined could not be broadcast in the standard Ghost Adventures format without changes to that format that the network was not willing to make. The footage exists. Its existence has been acknowledged in the limited internal communications about the episode that have circulated among people connected to the production. What it shows is what Bagans' exposure addresses with the most specific language he has applied to any unreleased Ghost Adventures evidence in any public communication he has made about the franchise's suppressed material. The third category is Aaron Goodwin's account. Goodwin was present during the lockdown session's peak intensity window, and his on-camera account of what occurred during that window was recorded in full during the post-lockdown evidence review that the show's standard format includes at the end of each investigation. The broadcast version of the episode contains an edited version of that account whose specific edits remove the most significant elements of what Goodwin described experiencing. Bagans' exposure addresses what the unedited account contained, what Goodwin said in the complete post-lockdown review that the broadcast version did not include, and why the network's decision to edit it produced the most significant gap between the broadcast record and the complete investigation record that the franchise has ever created. Zach Bagans has discussed his personal experiences during Ghost Adventures investigations more candidly than any other paranormal television presenter has discussed comparable experiences across the genre's history. He has described physical effects, psychological impacts, and what he characterizes as attachments, the specific class of post-investigation consequence that his experience across 20 seasons of direct exposure to extreme paranormal phenomenon has given him a practiced framework for recognizing and addressing. His public record of discussing these personal experiences is extensive, and it has been consistent in its candor across the franchise's run. There is one investigation whose personal impact he has not discussed, not in general terms. The audience that follows the franchise closely enough to track the pattern of Bagans' personal disclosures across his public communications has noted the absence of any substantive personal account of the controversial episode's investigation in the years since it broadcast. Not a reference to it being difficult, not an acknowledgement that it produced personal consequences consistent with his descriptions of other significant investigations' impacts. Silence. The specific silence that the Ghost Adventures audience has learned to recognize as the indicator that Bagans has drawn a boundary around something whose discussion he has determined requires a specific context that casual interview format does not provide. What he experienced during the lockdown session's peak intensity window is what the exposure now addresses directly for the first time. His account of what occurred during that window from his personal perspective, what he encountered, what he experienced physically and perceptually, and what the specific quality of the encounter produced in a man whose 20 years of direct exposure to extreme paranormal phenomenon had built a reference framework comprehensive enough to assess what most investigators would encounter without the context to understand, is the most significant element of the exposure. Not because it is more dramatic than the instrument data or the camera footage, because it comes from the person whose credibility in this specific domain, whose accumulated direct experience with the class of phenomenon documented in this investigation is the most defensible source of assessment available. Bagans knows what happened during that lockdown session at that location. He knows it with the specific confidence of someone who was there and who has spent 20 years developing the experiential vocabulary to understand what being there means. What he experienced is what he is now exposing. And the exposure is the first time he has been willing to provide the context he determined was necessary before he could discuss it honestly. Travel Channel's role in the production of the controversial episode and in the decisions that shaped what the audience received as its broadcast version is the dimension of the exposure that Bagans addresses with the most evident weight, because the network's editorial involvement in the episode was not the standard content management relationship that governs every Ghost Adventures broadcast. It was something more specific and more consequential. The standard Ghost Adventures editorial relationship between Bagans Production and Travel Channel operates within a framework whose parameters both parties understand and whose application to specific pieces of evidence has produced friction across multiple prior seasons without ever producing the kind of fundamental disagreement about the nature of the editorial process itself that the controversial episode generated. Travel Channel reviews the production's assembled episodes, applies its content standards and editorial judgment to specific segments, and communicates its decisions to the production in terms that reflect the standard commercial television relationship between a network and its programming supplier. That process has produced cuts and modifications across the franchise's run, evidence that was ambiguous enough to be softened without misrepresenting the investigation, segments that exceeded the network's content parameters for its audience, and moments whose legal or reputational implications the network's legal team identified as requiring management. The editorial process applied to the controversial episode was not that standard process. What Bagans describes about the network's engagement with the episode's footage is an involvement that went beyond the standard review framework in its speed, in the level of the organizational hierarchy at which decisions were made, and in the specific nature of the instructions that came back to the production about what the episode was permitted to contain. The instructions were not editorial recommendations, they were restrictions, specific, non-negotiable, and delivered with a finality whose character Bagans characterizes in the exposure as unlike anything in his 20 years of experience navigating the production's relationship with the network. What produced that character? What made the network's response to the controversial episode's footage so different from its response to every comparable piece of Ghost Adventures evidence across the franchise's run is the question that the exposure answers by describing what the footage contained. The network's response was proportional to what they saw, and what they saw in the controversial episode's uncut footage was something that produced in the people whose professional responsibility it was to make editorial decisions about Ghost Adventures content the same response that it produced in everyone who has reviewed the complete footage record. The response of people who understood immediately that what they were looking at could not be managed within any framework they possessed. The Ghost Adventures audience that has followed the franchise across 20 seasons has been building a relationship with the investigation's documented evidence record that the exposure now fundamentally recontextualizes. Not because the exposure contradicts what the broadcast record contains, nothing Bagans reveals about the controversial episode suggests that what the audience was shown was fabricated or misrepresented in the basic sense of presenting something as real that was not. What the exposure establishes is that the broadcast record of the most controversial Ghost Adventures episode was incomplete in a specific and significant way, that the investigation produced evidence whose existence and whose character the audience was not informed of, and that the editorial decisions that produced that incompleteness were made for reasons that went beyond the ordinary content management considerations the franchise's editorial history had previously generated. For the audience members whose engagement with Ghost Adventures has been oriented toward the evidence, who have followed the franchise because of what its investigations have documented rather than because of the entertainment format that packages that documentation, the exposure produces a specific and consequential reassessment. Every broadcast episode now needs to be understood as the portion of the investigation's complete record that the network determined could be shown, not as the complete record itself. That reassessment has been available as a hypothesis across the franchise's run, based on the pattern of content management decisions that the prior season's production history has made visible. The exposure converts the hypothesis into a confirmed fact. The broadcast Ghost Adventures record is a managed fraction of the complete Ghost Adventures record. The controversial episode is the most documented evidence of that fraction, the case where the management was most extensive, most consequential, and whose extent Bagans has now chosen to expose rather than continue to accept. What the exposure means for the Ghost Adventures community's relationship to the investigation's prior broadcast record is a question each viewer will have to answer individually. what it means for the franchise's future, for the relationship between Bagans and Travel Channel, for the production's approach to the evidence management decisions the network applies to its investigation footage, and for what the audience can expect from the investigation going forward, is the question that the exposure opens without fully closing. Bagans made a decision to expose this truth. That decision has consequences for every prior decision the production has made about what the audience was shown, and working through those consequences is what the Ghost Adventures community is now going to be doing. The truth Zak Bagans just exposed changes three things simultaneously. The episode's standing in the broadcast record. What the audience understood as controversial for the reasons the broadcast version generated is now revealed as controversial for reasons that the broadcast version was never permitted to establish. The complete record of what the investigation produced at that location is more significant than anything the franchise has ever broadcast. The broadcast record's relationship to the complete investigation record, the exposure confirms what the most attentive Ghost Adventures viewers have been sensing across multiple seasons without having it verified. The broadcast version is a managed fraction. This episode is the clearest proof of how significant that fraction is. And Bagans' own position, he operated within the editorial framework that produced the incomplete version for years. The exposure ends that. He decided the audience deserved the truth and delivered it. 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures have been building toward this moment. The most controversial episode was controversial for the wrong reasons. Now the right ones are public. And what they reveal about what that investigation actually found is what the franchise has always been pointing toward. Zak Bagans has been the face of Ghost Adventures for 20 seasons. The franchise he built from a consumer camera and an overnight lockdown at the Goldfield Hotel into the most recognized paranormal investigation brand in television history. He has never walked away from it, until now. What happened behind the scenes that produced the decision nobody in the Ghost Adventures audience was prepared for is what this video documents completely. Subscribe and stay until the very end because the full story changes everything. Zak Bagans did not stumble into Ghost Adventures, he built it. The origin story is documented well enough that the Ghost Adventures audience knows its outline. The consumer camera, the overnight lockdown at the Goldfield Hotel in Goldfield, Nevada, the independent documentary whose footage convinced a network that what Bagans was doing in front of a camera in haunted locations was different enough from everything else the paranormal television genre was producing to justify a broadcast deal. What is less well documented, what the 20 seasons of broadcast content that followed the original documentary have never fully represented, is what sustaining Ghost Adventures across 20 seasons at the level of personal investment and personal exposure that the show's authenticity has always required has cost the man at the center of it. Ghost Adventures works because Zak Bagans is genuinely invested in what the show documents. Not invested in the entertainment format, invested in the paranormal question itself, in the specific and personal way that a man whose first significant paranormal experience produced a response that organized the subsequent decades of his professional life around understanding it is invested. He has discussed this origin investment across multiple public communications in terms that communicate something specific about the character of the commitment the show represents. Not a career choice, but a vocation. The specific kind of sustained personal calling that produces the quality of genuine engagement the audience recognizes in his on-camera presence, and that distinguishes Ghost Adventures from the paranormal television format's more manufactured alternatives. Sustaining a vocation across 20 seasons of cable television production, with everything that sustained commercial production requires from the person whose genuine personal investment is the product's most essential commercial asset, produces a specific and cumulative toll whose character the broadcast format has never been designed to fully represent. The physical toll of sustained direct exposure to extreme locations under production conditions that prioritize dramatic content alongside investigative rigor. The psychological toll of 20 years of genuine engagement with phenomenon whose implications for the nature of reality, his scientific collaborators, and his own experience have been building toward conclusions that his public communications have been carefully managing. The professional toll of maintaining the creative and investigative integrity of a franchise whose commercial scale has created institutional pressures whose direction is not always aligned with the investigation's genuine demands. All of it has been accumulating across 20 seasons. And what happened behind the scenes that produced the decision this video's title describes, is the specific development whose character made continued accumulation something Bagans assessed as no longer sustainable in the form Ghost Adventures has always required from him. The Ghost Adventures franchise at 20 seasons is an institutional entity whose scale and whose commercial infrastructure bear almost no resemblance to the independent documentary that produced it. The Travel Channel broadcast relationship, the Haunted Museum in Las Vegas, whose permanent existence as a physical institution whose curation Bagans has personally overseen, gives the franchise a presence outside the broadcast format that no comparable paranormal television production has established. The Demon House documentary, whose specific production circumstances and whose specific personal consequences Bagans has discussed more candidly than any other single investigation in his public record. The books, the merchandise, the production company infrastructure whose operation the franchise's commercial scale has required, the social media presence whose sustained maintenance is its own specific and ongoing demand on the attention and the creative energy of the person at its center. Building all of that across 20 seasons while simultaneously maintaining the genuine investigative engagement that the show's authenticity requires, while continuing to personally enter locations whose extreme character the franchise's reputation for going further than any comparable production has established as the baseline expectation, is not the sustainable professional proposition that the commercial success it has produced might suggest from the outside. The people who have worked closest to Bagans across the franchise's production history have described in various partial accounts the specific quality of sustained professional and personal demand that operating at the center of an institution of this scale, while maintaining the personal investment whose authenticity is the institution's most essential asset, produces. It is not the ordinary demand of a successful television career. It is the specific demand of being simultaneously the creative force, the investigative presence, the public face, the brand identity, and the genuine personal heart of something that 20 seasons of commercial development have made far larger than any of those individual roles can be sustained within by a single person operating at the level of genuine investment the show has always required. What happened behind the scenes that made that specific combination of demands unsustainable is the specific development this video documents, and understanding it requires understanding what the 20 seasons of building it produced not just commercially but personally. The Zach Bagans Haunted Museum in Las Vegas is the most direct physical expression of the Ghost Adventures franchise's relationship to the paranormal question that Bagans has ever created. It is not a merchandise store or a tourist attraction organized around the show's brand. It is a collection. Bagans' personal, curatorial, sustained engagement with the physical objects whose anomalous histories and whose documented effects on the people who encounter them he has been accumulating and studying across the span of his investigation career. The Dybbuk box, the Bela Lugosi mirror, the Charles Manson items, the specific objects whose provenance and whose documented behavioral history place them in the category of dangerous in a specific and non-metaphorical sense that Bagans has discussed in the careful terms of someone whose direct experience with the objects has given him a framework for that characterization that his public communications manage carefully. The museum is not simply a collection of spooky things organized for visitor entertainment. It is the physical archive of Bagans' investigation career, the accumulated material evidence of 20 years of direct engagement with the most extreme documented paranormal objects that his investigation history has produced, or that his curation has identified as warranting inclusion. Maintaining that archive, being the person whose physical proximity to its contents is the most sustained of anyone connected to the institution, whose curatorial decisions about what enters it and how it is managed reflect a genuine and personal assessment of the specific risks those decisions involve, is a sustained exposure whose specific character the people who have been closest to Bagans across the museum's operational history have described in terms that communicate something about the cumulative toll of that exposure that the institution's public presentation as a visitor attraction does not fully convey. The Demon House is the clearest documented precedent for what sustained proximity to the category of phenomenon the museum's collection represents produces in Bagans personally. He purchased it, he filmed in it, he demolished it before any other investigator could access it, and he has discussed what the production of the Demon House documentary did to him physically and personally in more specific and more candid terms than he has applied to any other single investigation in his public record. The museum contains dozens of objects whose individual histories place them in the same category as the demon house. The cumulative effect of sustained proximity to that collection, whatever the specific character of that cumulative effect is in the terms that Baggins's direct experience of it has established, is part of the behind-the-scenes story whose development this video documents. The Ghost Adventures broadcast record across 20 seasons is an extraordinarily extensive public documentation of Zak Baggins's investigation career, hundreds of lockdown sessions, dozens of locations across multiple countries, a body of documented evidence whose breadth and whose cumulative character represent the most extensive paranormal investigation archive that any single presenter has produced in the history of the television format. What the broadcast record does not document, what the production framework that shapes raw investigation footage into broadcast episodes was not designed to represent, is the behind-the-scenes reality of what sustaining that investigation across 20 seasons has required of the people who make it and of Baggins specifically. The gap between the investigation and the broadcast version of the investigation is not simply an editing gap. It is a gap between what the investigation actually produces and what the commercial framework within which it is presented can accommodate showing. The evidence management decisions that the network's editorial process has applied to the most significant findings across the franchise's run, the personal consequences that sustained direct exposure to the extreme locations the franchise's reputation has established as its investigative domain produces in the people experiencing them that the broadcast format's adventure presentation has consistently framed as dramatic rather than genuinely costly. The specific professional tensions that maintaining the creative integrity of a genuine investigation within the commercial structure of a major network franchise generates across 20 seasons of sustained production. The crew members whose experiences during the most extreme investigation sessions the show has conducted have produced documented personal consequences that the broadcast episodes have referenced without fully characterizing. The specific quality of what Aaron Goodwin and Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley, the crew members whose sustained presence in the franchise's investigation sessions gives them the most direct experience of what those sessions produce beyond what the cameras capture, have communicated in the limited accounts available outside the broadcast record about what 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures has produced in them, and what Baggins himself has been carrying across the franchise's full run that the broadcast format's management of his public presentation has been containing, and that the development this video documents has apparently finally moved beyond the point where continued containment is something he is able to maintain. The specific development behind the scenes that produced Zak Baggins's decision to step away from Ghost Adventures is the element of this video whose direct characterization is simultaneously the most significant and the most carefully constructed, because the complete account of what happened involves a convergence of factors whose individual significance the prior parts of this video have been establishing, and whose combined weight produced in Baggins's a specific assessment about the sustainability of continuing the franchise in the form it has always required from him. The convergence includes the cumulative personal cost dimension, whose character the prior parts of this video have established, the sustained physical and psychological toll of 20 seasons of direct investigative exposure at the level of genuine personal investment that the show's authenticity demands, the specific impact of the haunted museum's sustained proximity demands on a person whose direct experience with the objects it contains gives him the most specific available understanding of what that proximity involves, and the accumulated weight of what the complete investigation record contains that the broadcast format has been managing rather than fully communicating. It includes a specific investigation development from the most recent production period whose character placed it in a category that the prior season's most extreme findings had not more of the same, more extreme, more documented, more significant in the specific technical terms of what the investigation's instrument data and its direct experiential component established about what the investigation had encountered, something qualitatively different from the prior record's most extreme moments in a way that the people closest to the production during the relevant period have described in consistent terms as producing in Baggins a response whose character they had not previously observed across 20 seasons of watching him process what the investigation generates. The institutional dimension is the third component, the travel channel relationship, the franchise's commercial scale, the specific tension between what the investigation's most recent findings demanded in terms of honest public communication and what the institutional framework within which the investigation operates was willing to accommodate. The convergence of all three, the cumulative personal cost, the qualitatively different recent finding, and the institutional tension, is what produced the decision, what the decision specifically involves, what quitting Ghost Adventures in the specific form this video's title describes actually means for the franchise and for what comes next, is what the following sections establish. Zak Bagans stepping away from Ghost Adventures is not a retirement, and it is not a simple production hiatus of the kind that television schedules regularly require. It is something whose specific character is more significant than either of those conventional frameworks for understanding a presenter's departure from a long-running franchise fully captures, and whose specific implications for the Ghost Adventures brand, for the travel channel relationship, and for the paranormal investigation community that has built its understanding of what the franchise represents around Bagans' specific and sustained presence at its center, are what this section of the video addresses directly. The decision, as it has been communicated in the accounts available from people connected to the production, is a decision about form rather than about the investigation itself. Bagans' commitment to the paranormal question, to the investigation whose sustained pursuit has organized his professional and personal life since the Goldfield Hotel experience that produced the original documentary, is not what the decision addresses. The investigation continues. The haunted museum continues. The specific engagement with what the investigation has been finding and what it means continues. What the decision addresses is the specific form that engagement has taken across 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures as a travel channel broadcast franchise. The specific requirements that the commercial production relationship and the broadcast format impose on his personal investment in the investigation and on the public communication of what the investigation produces. He is stepping away from the form, not from the work. The distinction is significant because it establishes what comes next as something other than a retirement from the paranormal investigation field, and because it communicates something specific about where the decision comes from that a straightforward retirement or a simple production burnout would not. A man who steps away from the form of his investigation while maintaining the investigation itself is a man whose assessment of the situation is that the form has become an obstacle to the investigation rather than a vehicle for it. That assessment and the specific character of what made the commercial broadcast format feel like an obstacle rather than a vehicle in the period that produced the decision is what the next section of this video addresses. The specific reason that the Ghost Adventures broadcast format has become an obstacle to the investigation rather than a vehicle for it, in the terms that the decision this video documents communicates about Bagans' current assessment of the relationship between the two, is connected to what the investigation's most recent findings have been establishing about the nature of what the show has been documenting. The Ghost Adventures broadcast record is built around a specific and sustained commercial premise, the ongoing dramatic investigation of locations whose paranormal histories and whose documented outputs provide the content whose delivery the network's audience relationship depends on. That premise requires the investigation to be understood as an ongoing approach to answers rather than as the documentation of findings whose character the answers dimension of the premise cannot accommodate. What the investigation has been finding in the most recent production period, and what the qualitatively different development this video's prior sections have referenced without fully characterizing, is evidence whose character places it in the answer rather than the approach category, not more compelling approach evidence. Evidence whose implications, if communicated publicly in the specific and direct terms that Bagans' 20 years of investigative experience give him the framework to characterize accurately, would require the broadcast format to do something the commercial premise cannot accommodate. Acknowledge that the investigation has arrived somewhere. The prior season's most extreme findings were manageable within the format because their character, however dramatic and however evidentially significant, could be framed as compelling approach evidence, as the most significant steps yet toward an answer that the investigation was still working toward. What the most recent findings have produced in Bagans' assessment of the investigation's current position is something that the approach framing no longer fits, and communicating that assessment publicly within the broadcast framework whose commercial premise depends on the approach framing is the specific tension whose irresolvability produced the decision this video documents, The Ghost Adventures audience that has built its relationship to the franchise across 20 seasons of watching Zach Bagans conduct the most extensive, sustained paranormal investigation in television history deserves an honest account of what his decision to step away from the broadcast format means for the investigation's future and for their relationship to the complete record the investigation has produced. The broadcast record they have followed across 20 seasons is the portion of the complete Ghost Adventures investigation record that the Travel Channel Relationships editorial framework has permitted to reach them, not the complete record. Bagans has communicated this in terms that have become progressively more direct across the franchise's most recent seasons. The language about what the cameras captured and what the network's editorial process has done with the most significant elements of the complete record has been building toward the specific, kind of honest public accounting that the broadcast format's commercial constraints have always prevented him from fully delivering. The decision to step away from the broadcast format is connected to that building, to the progressive narrowing of the distance between what the investigation has found and what Bagans has determined the audience deserves to know about what it has found. Stepping away from the commercial format whose constraints have been the specific mechanism preventing the complete honest communication of the investigation's findings is not the end of that communication. It is potentially the removal of the primary institutional obstacle to its delivery. What comes next? What Bagak builds outside the Travel Channel broadcast relationship with the investigation's complete record and with the specific recent findings whose character the broadcast format could not accommodate is the chapter of the Ghost Adventures story whose development the audience that has followed 20 seasons of the broadcast version has been investing in across the entirety of those 20 seasons without knowing that this is where the investment was building toward. The format that contained the investigation is ending. The investigation is not. Zach Bagans built Ghost Adventures from a consumer camera and a genuine question into the most recognized paranormal investigation franchise in the history of television. 20 seasons, hundreds of investigations, a body of documented evidence whose breadth the paranormal television genre has never matched, and whose complete contents, including the significant portions whose broadcast suppression the franchise's most recent public communications have been approaching an honest account of, represent the most extensive private paranormal investigation archive that any individual has ever assembled. The decision to step away from the broadcast format that has been the vehicle for the investigation's public documentation is not the conclusion of what the 20 seasons were building toward. It is the conclusion of the specific institutional arrangement whose commercial requirements have been the primary obstacle to the complete honest public communication of what the investigation has found. What that decision changes about everything the Ghost Adventures broadcast record represents is the context within which the record's most significant gaps, the evidence management decisions, the editorial suppressions, the distance between what the investigation produced and what the audience was shown, need to be understood. They were not simply the ordinary content management decisions of a commercial television production. They were the specific mechanism by which the gap between what the Ghost Adventures investigation found and what the institutional framework around it could accommodate showing was maintained across 20 seasons of production. Bagans stepping away from that institutional framework is the first step toward the closure of that gap. What the complete account of what Ghost Adventures found, delivered outside the commercial constraints that have been managing it, looks like is the question that the decision opens. The investigation found things. The format contained what the finding communicated. The format is ending. The finding is not. 20 seasons of Ghost Adventures were building toward this moment. The moment when the man who built the investigation decided that the institutional vehicle whose commercial requirements had always placed limits on the honest communication of the investigation's findings was a vehicle he was no longer willing to accept the limits of. What comes next is what those 20 seasons were always pointing toward, and what it contains is what the broadcast record's most attentive audience has been sensing across the investigation's full run without having it confirmed. The confirmation is coming. The format that delayed it is ending, and Zach Bagans, at whatever personal cost the decision represents, has decided that the investigation deserves the honest account the broadcast format was never equipped to provide. Before Ghost Adventures existed, before the Travel Channel, before the Haunted Museum, before any of it, there was a young man in a Michigan apartment who saw something in a hallway that he could not explain and could not walk away from. That moment did not launch a career. It launched an obsession, and the distance between that moment and where Zach Bagans stands today, what he has built, what he has lost, What the years of chasing darkness have done to the person underneath the persona is a story that 26 seasons of television were never designed to tell. What really happened to Zak Bagans goes deeper than any episode he ever filmed. It goes into the parts of his life that the cameras did not follow, the relationships that did not survive, the health that deteriorated in ways he disclosed only partially, the compulsions that tightened their grip the more he fed them, and the specific question that has followed him since that Michigan hallway, and that despite everything he has built in the decades since, he has never been able to fully answer. Stay until the end. This is the complete story. Zachary Alexander Bagans was born on April 3, 1977, in Washington, D.C. His parents divorced when he was young, and his childhood was divided between Glendale, California, and the Detroit metropolitan area of Michigan. Those two geographies shaped him in ways that are visible if you know where to look. The California years gave him an exposure to entertainment culture, to the specific texture of a place where image and ambition are the ambient atmosphere, where people construct versions of themselves for public consumption as a matter of routine. The Michigan years gave him something different. The industrial decay of the Detroit region in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the abandoned factories and shuttered neighborhoods, the specific quality of a landscape in the process of becoming a ruin, left an imprint on his aesthetic sensibility that no production designer could have manufactured. Zak Bagans grew up around places that had been left behind, buildings that held the residue of everything that had happened in them, and then been emptied of the people who made it happen. That relationship to abandoned space was not something he acquired as a television host. It was something the geography of his childhood built into him before he had a name for what it meant. He was not a particularly social child in the conventional sense. People who knew him before he became a public figure described someone who existed at an angle to the ordinary social world, who was drawn more to the margins of experience than to its center, who was curious about things that most of his peers found uncomfortable to think about. Death, what persists after it, whether the places where significant things happen retain something of what happened in them. These were not casual interests. They were consuming ones, and they consumed him quietly, privately, across the years of an ordinary Midwestern adolescence, until the night in 2002 when they stopped being theoretical. He was 25 years old and living in Trenton, Michigan, working as a wedding DJ, building a life that had nothing on its surface to indicate what was coming. The apartment was ordinary. The hallway was ordinary. And then it was not. The apparition he encountered that night, a female figure that he has described in multiple accounts as fully formed, visible, and entirely outside any framework his existing understanding of the world could accommodate, did not frighten him into retreat. It pulled him forward. He has said, in interviews across the years, that what the encounter produced in him was not fear as a terminal state, but fear as a beginning, a door that opened onto a question he could not close again. Who was she? What was she? What did it mean that she was there? And what else was out there in the dark that he had been living alongside without knowing it? Within months, he had acquired his first camera. Within a year, he had begun researching locations associated with documented paranormal activity. Within 2 years, he was in Goldfield, Nevada, in the abandoned Goldfield Hotel, filming the raw and unscripted documentary footage that would become the foundation of everything that followed. The decision to go to Goldfield was not a career calculation. There was no career to calculate around. It was the decision of a person who needed to know something and had identified the most direct available route to finding out. What that decision cost him in terms of the life he did not build while he was building Ghost Adventures instead is a question his public narrative rarely frames directly, but that the timeline of his personal life answers clearly enough for anyone paying attention. Ghost Adventures premiered on October 17, 2008, and the version of Zak Bagans that the audience met in those early seasons was a person operating at the absolute peak of a specific kind of fearless energy. He was 31 years old. He had nothing to protect because he had not yet built anything worth protecting. He walked into Bobby Mackey's music world and provoked whatever was in there with a directness that the show's producers initially found alarming. He sat alone in the basement of Eastern State Penitentiary after the rest of the crew had left because he was not finished yet. He went to Pavelia Island, a location whose history of plague death and psychiatric institutionalization made it one of the most psychologically extreme environments that European paranormal investigation had to offer. And he did not leave when everything in his body told him to. That fearlessness was not performance. It was the authentic output of a person for whom the question being investigated mattered more than the personal cost of investigating it. What the audience was not watching during those years was what the production schedule was doing to the rest of his life. Ghost Adventures at its peak was not a show that filmed occasionally. It was a production whose location requirements, travel demands, and overnight lockdown format created a professional life that was structurally incompatible with the ordinary rhythms of personal relationship and domestic stability. Zach Bagans has never married. The relationships that developed and ended across the years of the show's production have been addressed in his public presence only obliquely, in the way that a person addresses things they have processed but not fully resolved. The specific texture of building a professional identity so completely around an obsession that the obsession and the identity become indistinguishable, so that the question of who you are when the cameras are not rolling becomes genuinely difficult to answer, is something the episode count of Ghost Adventures documents without ever naming directly. He gave the show everything, and the show took it. By the middle seasons of Ghost Adventures, people who worked closely with Zach Bagans were noticing something that the show's cameras were not positioned to document: the physical toll of years of overnight location shooting, of sustained sleep disruption, of repeated exposure to environments whose air quality and structural conditions created genuine occupational health considerations, was becoming visible in ways that production makeup and editing could partially but not entirely address. He has spoken publicly about health issues across the years, always in terms that acknowledged their existence without fully mapping their scope. Chronic fatigue, whose specific character differed from ordinary tiredness in ways that people who have experienced it describe as qualitatively different from anything that rest alone resolves. Physical symptoms whose connection to specific locations he has discussed in the framework of paranormal attachment, a framework that his medical advisors presumably engaged with differently than his paranormal research community did. The gap between those two frameworks, between the investigator's explanation and the physician's explanation, is one that Zach Bagans has lived inside for long enough that the distinction may have become less important to him than the fact of the symptoms themselves. The Demon House investigation represents the most publicly documented instance of what extended paranormal exposure produced in him physically and psychologically. The Gary, Indiana property he purchased in 2014 after a family reported experiencing what they described as a demonic infestation severe enough to warrant state child protective services. Involvement was not a location Bagans investigated briefly. He lived there. He filmed there across an extended period. And what happened to him during that time, the physical deterioration, the behavioral changes that people on the production documented, and that he subsequently addressed in the film he made about the experience, was significant enough that he had the building demolished after filming was complete. Not sold, demolished. A person who demolishes a property rather than sell it or walk away from it is communicating something about what happened there that the language of a standard episode of Ghost Adventures was not equipped to carry. The story of what happened at the Demon House in Gary, Indiana, is the most important chapter in understanding what Ghost Adventures ultimately did to Zach Bagans, because it is the chapter where the framework of television investigation gave way entirely to something that operated by different rules. The Ammons family, LaToya Ammons, her mother Rosa Campbell, and her 3 children had reported experiences in the property on Carolina Street that included children walking backward up walls, family members speaking in voices that were not their own, and a series of events documented by social workers and medical professionals that the official state record treated with a seriousness that official records in this area almost never produce. When that story reached Bagans, he did not pitch it to a network and wait for a production green light. He purchased the house with his own money before a single camera arrangement was in place. That decision tells you more about where he was psychologically at that point in his career than any interview he has given about it. What the filming period at the Demon House produced in him has been described differently by different people who were present. The documentary he released in 2019 shows a version of those events. What people who were on the production have said about what the documentary does not show suggests that version is partial. What is documented in the film itself is a progressive deterioration across the filming period, in his physical presentation, in his behavioral patterns, in the specific quality of his engagement with the property and with the people around him. That is visible enough on screen that viewers who watch it carefully have consistently described it as one of the more genuinely disturbing documents the paranormal genre has produced, not because of what the house contained, because of what it appeared to do to the person investigating it. He had the building torn down in 2016. He kept the staircase. It is in the museum now, and whatever he believes came with it is something he has chosen to keep in his proximity rather than put at a distance. That choice is the chapter of the Demon House story that the demolition did not resolve. The Zak Bagans Haunted Museum opened in Las Vegas in October of 2017, occupying a 1920s mansion on Charleston Boulevard that had its own documented history before Bagans acquired it. The collection he installed inside it was not assembled for the museum. It was assembled across years of personal acquisition that preceded the museum's existence, and that the museum ultimately provided a permanent home for. The Dybbuk box, whose history of reputed demonic attachment Bagans had documented in a previous investigation, Charles Manson's television set, Jack Kevorkian's van, Ed Gein's cauldron, Michael Jackson's mirror, acquired from Neverland Ranch, the possessed staircase from the Demon House in Gary, objects whose connection to violence, death, mental illness, and documented suffering was not incidental to their acquisition, but central to it. What the museum communicates about Zak Bagans that no interview has said directly is that the accumulation is not curatorial. A curator acquires objects for their historical or cultural significance and maintains a professional relationship to them. What Bagans has built is something closer to a private cosmology, a physical manifestation of a belief system organized around the idea that suffering leaves traces in objects, and that those traces are real and meaningful and worth being near. He lives with this collection. He works in its proximity. He continues to add to it. After everything that 26 seasons of Ghost Adventures produced in him, the health consequences, the personal costs, the specific deterioration that the Demon House filming documented, the response was not withdrawal from the things he believes carry darkness. It was deeper immersion. The museum is the most honest self-portrait Zak Bagans has ever produced, and what it portrays is a person for whom the question that opened in that Michigan hallway in 2002 has not closed. It has expanded. It has become the organizing principle of everything. And the cost of that expansion is visible in the collection itself, in the objects chosen, in the building maintained, in the person who cannot stop adding to it. The version of Zak Bagans that the public has access to is a carefully maintained construction, not dishonest. The fear on camera is real, the obsession is real, the genuine investigative commitment is real, but selective in the way that all public personas are selective. The things that do not appear in that construction are the things that the people closest to him across the years of Ghost Adventures have been most careful about in what they say publicly. The specific texture of his private life during the production years, the relationships that the show's demands made impossible to sustain, the degree to which the line between the investigator and the investigation had, by the later seasons, become difficult to locate from either side, the health issues whose full dimension his public statements have consistently understated, and the specific quality of his engagement with the material he works with, the haunted objects, the cursed locations, the documented suffering he has spent his adult life putting himself in proximity to, that the people who have watched it up close describe in terms that are more concerned than celebratory. He has spoken in interviews about loneliness, not dramatically, not in a way designed to generate sympathy, but in the matter-of-fact way that a person speaks about a condition they have accommodated rather than resolved. The life that Ghost Adventures required of him was not a life that made the ordinary architecture of sustained human relationship easy to build or maintain. He was gone constantly. He was in extreme environments constantly. He was operating in a professional context that made specific and unusual demands on his psychological and physical resources constantly. And the person you become across years of that existence is a person who has been shaped by it in ways that the ordinary social world does not always know what to do with. That is the version of Zak Bagans that the show never had room for. The one that exists when the cameras are not running and the lockdown is over and the building is empty and the question is still there. The same way it was in the Michigan hallway in 2002, waiting for an answer that has not come yet. There is a version of Ghost Adventures that longtime viewers identified without being able to fully articulate what they were seeing. The show that existed in seasons 1 through 5 had a specific quality of genuine uncertainty, of a team that did not know what they were going to find and was visibly affected by what they found. The show that existed in seasons 15 through 20 had a different quality, more polished, more confident in its own mythology, more settled into the narrative frameworks that the audience had come to expect. And something in that settling was lost, not fabricated. The locations were still real. The evidence was still documented. The cast was still the same people, but the specific quality of not knowing, of being genuinely at the edge of understanding in real time, had been replaced by something more managed, more produced, more aware of what a Ghost Adventures episode was supposed to look and feel like. What that change reflected about Zak Bagans is the most complicated dimension of his story, because the shift was not cynical. It was not the result of a deliberate decision to trade authenticity for production value. It was the natural consequence of what years of sustained investigation produces in a person, a familiarity with the extreme that gradually changes the relationship to it. The locations that would have undone him in Season 2 were locations he could walk through in Season 18 with a professional composure that the early seasons did not have. That composure is not indifference. It is something harder to name. The accumulation of exposure that changes not what you believe, but how you experience what you believe. And it made the later seasons of Ghost Adventures something that the people who loved the early seasons recognized as the same show, while understanding, without being able to say exactly why, that it was not quite the same man making it. Zach Bagans is in his late 40s now. The Haunted Museum is open and operating and continues to be one of the more unusual cultural institutions in Las Vegas, which is not a city that lacks for unusual cultural institutions. He continues to investigate, to produce, to engage with the paranormal research community that Ghost Adventures helped build into the mainstream phenomenon it has become. He continues to acquire objects for the collection. He continues to put himself in proximity to the things he believes carry darkness, to the locations where documented suffering has left whatever it leaves, to the question that has organized his entire adult life around itself without providing the answer that would allow him to stop. That is the heartbreaking part, not the health, not the loneliness, not the relationships that the production years made impossible. Those are the costs, and they are real, and they matter. But the truly heartbreaking dimension of what happened to Zach Bagans is that after everything, after 26 seasons, after the Demon House, after the museum, after the decades of lockdowns in the darkest buildings on Earth, the question is still open. He has not found what he is looking for. He has found extraordinary things. He has documented experiences that the scientific community cannot explain and that millions of viewers cannot dismiss. He has built the most significant paranormal investigation franchise in television history out of a single unanswered question encountered in a Michigan hallway at 25 years old. And the question is still there, waiting, the same way it always was. That is what happened to Zach Bagans, and it is the most human story that Ghost Adventures ever contained, hidden in plain sight across every season, visible in every investigation, audible in every moment when the building goes quiet and he is standing alone in the dark and asking one more time if anyone is there. If you want more stories like this one, subscribe now and turn your notifications on. There is more coming. There is a dimension of Zach Bagans that his Ghost Adventures audience knows existed but has never fully engaged with. The creative ambitions that ran parallel to the investigation work, and that reveal a person whose relationship to his own public image was more complicated and more self-aware than the lockdown format of the show generally allowed to surface. He directed, he wrote, he produced projects that existed outside the Ghost Adventures framework and that reflected a genuine interest in storytelling as a craft, rather than simply as a vehicle for paranormal content delivery. The Demon House documentary was the most significant of these, and its reception, critical acknowledgement of its genuine unsettling quality sitting alongside skeptical readings of its factual claims, placed him in the specific uncomfortable position of a person whose creative work is taken more seriously than his investigative work by the institutions whose validation he was not primarily seeking. He did not make Demon House for critics. He made it because something happened in that building that he needed to document in a form that a standard Ghost Adventures episode could not contain. His book, Dark World, published in 2010 during the show's early peak, offered a version of his personal history and investigative philosophy that his audience received as confirmation of what they already believed about him and that the broader reading public largely did not encounter. He has worked on music. He has maintained creative interests that exist at a significant distance from the paranormal investigation brand that his name is commercially attached to. And those interests, the evidence of a person whose interior life is broader and more varied than the Ghost Adventures persona communicates, are the clearest available indication that the cost of building that persona across 2 decades is not simply the cost of the investigations themselves. It is the cost of becoming, in the public imagination, a single thing, when the person inside the persona has always been something more complicated and less easily categorized than that single thing allows. The gap between the public Zach Bagans and the private one is not a gap between performance and reality. The performance is part of the reality. The obsession is genuine. The investigation is genuine. The fear and the commitment and the specific quality of a person, organized entirely around a question they cannot stop asking, are all genuine, but they are not the whole of him. And the years of Ghost Adventures, by making them the entirety of his public identity, created a situation in which the rest of him, The creative ambitions, the private losses, the loneliness he has mentioned without dwelling on, the health that the work has affected in ways he has not fully disclosed, exists in a shadow cast by the very thing he built. That shadow is where the heartbreaking part lives, and it is where Zak Bagans has been living, alongside everything else, for a very long time. He built an empire on the paranormal. He turned ghost hunting into a career worth millions. And somewhere along the way, the line between the investigator and the investigated began to blur in ways that even his most devoted fans struggle to explain. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what we're about to cover goes far beyond what any headline has managed to capture about the man, the mythology, and the quietly complicated reality of Zak Bagans at 49 years old. Zak Bagans was born on April 5, 1977, in Washington, D.C. He grew up in Libertyville, Illinois, a small suburban town in Lake County roughly 40 miles north of Chicago. By his own account, he was not a particularly extraordinary child. He was athletic, socially functional, and by most external measures, unremarkable. There was no family tradition of paranormal investigation. There were no early mentors who shaped his worldview around the supernatural. What there was, according to interviews he has given over more than 2 decades, was a single encounter. A single moment that he claims restructured the architecture of his belief system entirely. He was in his early 20s, living in Trenton, Michigan, working a job that had nothing to do with television or production or fame. And he says he saw something that he could not explain. Whether or not you believe that encounter was real, it matters. It matters because it is the origin myth of everything that followed. It is the foundation stone upon which he constructed not just a career, but an identity so total and so consuming that by the time he reached his late 40s, it had become nearly impossible to separate the man from the persona. Ghost Adventures premiered on the Travel Channel on October 17, 2008. But before the series, there was a documentary. Bagans and his longtime collaborator Nick Groff produced a self-shot film in 2004. Shot primarily in the abandoned mining town of Goldfield, Nevada. That documentary, simply titled Ghost Adventures, circulated through film festivals and built enough of a following to attract television interest. It was raw. It was low budget. It had the kind of unpolished urgency that made it feel genuinely dangerous in a way that slicker productions could not manufacture. And that rawness was the thing that Travel Channel wanted to bottle. The series that followed ran for over 20 seasons across nearly 2 decades. It produced more than 200 episodes. It spawned multiple spin-offs, including Ghost Adventures, Screaming Room, Ghost Adventures, Quarantine, and Deadly Possessions. At its commercial peak, Ghost Adventures was one of the highest-rated programs on the Travel Channel, pulling in millions of viewers per episode during its strongest seasons between 2012 and 2016. Bagans became, by any honest accounting, the single most recognizable figure in paranormal entertainment in the United States. That is not a small thing. That is a specific kind of cultural dominance that very few people in any niche ever achieve. And yet, the lifestyle that came with that dominance is where the story becomes complicated. By 2015, Bagans had purchased the haunted museum property in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada. The building at 307 West Charleston Boulevard had a history. It had served as a private residence, as a law office, and had sat vacant for years before Bagans acquired it. He began converting it into what he described as a permanent installation of cursed, haunted, and paranormally significant objects. The museum opened to the public on October 16, 2017. It operates today as a ticketed attraction running tours of roughly 45 minutes, with a separate ticketed experience for what Bagans calls the most dangerous room in the building, the space containing the Dybbuk box. The Dybbuk box is an object that Bagans acquired in 2015. It is a wooden wine cabinet alleged to be a vessel for a malevolent Jewish spirit. The previous owner, Kevin Mannis, had sold it on eBay in 2003 with a written account of paranormal activity surrounding it. It passed through multiple hands before Bagans paid a reported amount in the tens of thousands of dollars to acquire it. He documented the acquisition on camera. He said during that filming that he felt immediate physical effects upon contact with the object. He said he became sick. He said his health declined in specific, measurable ways following extended exposure to it. This claim is worth sitting with, because Zak Bagans has made versions of this claim many times across many years, about many objects and many locations. And the pattern of those claims is one of the most revealing things about how his lifestyle has evolved and what it has cost him. In 2009, Bagans investigated the Poveglia Island location off the coast of Venice, Italy. Poveglia is a place with an unambiguous historical record of suffering. It served as a quarantine station during the bubonic plague in the 14th century. It later housed a psychiatric facility that operated until 1968. Hundreds of thousands of people died on that island across several centuries. The physical soil of the island contains measurable concentrations of human ash and bone fragment, the result of mass cremations during the plague years. When Bagans describes Poveglia as one of the most evil places on Earth, he is describing a location that has genuine historical claim to being among the most concentrated sites of human misery in European history. The paranormal interpretation is his. The historical reality is not. He reported feeling possessed during that investigation. He reported that something attached itself to him at Poveglia and did not fully let go. He filmed the aftermath. He showed on camera changes in his demeanor, his voice, his behavior. His colleagues expressed concern. His producers kept cameras rolling. This became one of the most watched episodes of Ghost Adventures and one of the most analyzed pieces of content in the show's long history. This is the lifestyle that Bagans chose and then built a business around. Repeated, voluntary exposure to locations of extreme historical trauma, combined with a personal belief system that those locations retain spiritual energy capable of attaching to and affecting living human beings. Every year, for over 2 decades, that is not a job. That is a vocation with physical consequences. Bagans has spoken openly in interviews across multiple platforms about chronic health issues. He has described persistent headaches, fatigue, mood instability, and what he characterizes as periods of darkness that descend without clear environmental cause. He has referenced these episodes in interviews with outlets including Entertainment Weekly, Rolling Stone, and in his own written works. He has attributed some portion of these experiences to the cumulative effect of years of paranormal investigation. He has, on several occasions, described feeling as though he is carrying something that other people cannot see. Now, that is his interpretation, and his interpretation exists within a belief system that a significant portion of the population does not share. But here is what is undeniable regardless of where you stand on the question of the paranormal. He has spent more than 2 decades in locations characterized by extreme physical conditions, including asbestos contamination, lead paint, compromised structural integrity, black mold, and in multiple international locations, documented biohazards. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky, where he has filmed multiple episodes, treated more than 63,000 tuberculosis patients during its operational period from 1910 to 1961. The air quality in that building during filming is not the air quality of a television studio. The abandoned prisons, the decommissioned hospitals, the centuries-old cemeteries in rural locations across the American South and Midwest, where ambient particulate matter from decomposed organic material enters the respiratory system without ceremony or warning. The physical toll of doing this work repeatedly in these specific environments over 20+ years is real regardless of anything supernatural. And Bagans, to his credit, has never pretended otherwise. By 2018, something in his public profile had shifted. He had always been intense, but the interviews from that period, taken in aggregate, showed a man under a different kind of weight. He spoke more frequently about isolation. He spoke about the difficulty of maintaining personal relationships given the demands of the show and the psychological texture of the work. He had ended a relationship with actress Holly Madison in 2016 after approximately 6 months of dating. Before that, there had been other relationships that had not sustained themselves against the pressure of his particular lifestyle. He has never married. As of 2026, he remains unmarried, without children, living in a custom-built compound in Las Vegas that he has described in interviews as being designed specifically to accommodate his unique psychological requirements, including multiple rooms dedicated to the containment and housing of objects from the museum's collection. Think about that for a moment. He lives in a house designed in part as an extension of his work. The objects follow him home. Or rather, he has built a home that makes space for the objects, because the objects are not separate from who he is. They are who he is. In 2020, during the early months of the global pandemic, Bagans filmed Ghost Adventures, Quarantine, which documented the investigation of his own home while the world was in lockdown. He was alone with a small crew. The outside world had effectively shut down, and his response was to turn the cameras inward. He filmed himself in his own space, hunting for evidence of the paranormal in the rooms where he slept, ate, and existed. He described the experience as one of the most disturbing of his career. And given his career, that is a sentence that carries considerable weight. The special aired on the Travel Channel in June of 2020. Viewer response was, by rating standards, strong. Critical response was more divided. Some reviewers noted that the content of the special seemed to reflect a man genuinely grappling with something beyond the theatrical. Others read it as an exceptionally well-produced piece of performance. The truth, as is so often the case, likely contains elements of both. What is not in dispute is that Bagans used one of the most disorienting periods of collective human experience in modern memory as an opportunity to go deeper into the specific psychological territory that defines his life. When the rest of the world was trying to escape, he was trying to find more of the thing that had always pulled him toward the dark. His film work complicates the narrative further. In 2012, Bagans produced and narrated Demon House, a documentary concerning a rental property at 3771 Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. The property had been the subject of a widely reported case involving a single mother named LaToya Ammons and her 3 children, who claimed to have experienced severe paranormal and demonic activity beginning in 2011. The case was unusual because it involved documented engagement from the Indiana Department of Child Services, the local police department, and a hospital whose staff members reported witnessing unexplainable events involving the children. These are not anonymous civilian claims. These are institutional records. Bagans purchased the house in 2014 for the reported price of $35,000. He and his crew filmed inside it for months. During that filming, he claims that members of his crew experienced physical and psychological effects, including injury, emotional breakdown, and in at least one documented case, a crew member who left the project abruptly and suffered what Bagans described as a sustained mental health crisis in the aftermath. Bagans himself, by his account, experienced a period of such severe personal disruption during the filming that he considered halting production entirely. The film was released in 2018. Before its wide release, Bagans demolished the house. He demolished a property that he owned, that he had purchased for the purpose of documentary investigation, before the film based on that investigation had reached its primary audience. He said he did it because it was dangerous to leave standing. He said he felt an obligation to prevent others from being drawn to it. The reaction to that decision split along the exact lines you would expect. His believers saw it as an act of moral responsibility. His critics saw it as the destruction of evidence. Both reactions are logical within their respective frameworks. What the demolition accomplished beyond the obvious was to ensure that no subsequent investigator, journalist, or researcher could independently examine the physical space. The story of 3771 Carolina Street became, at that point, entirely dependent on the documentation that Bagans chose to release. That is a pattern worth noting. Across his career, Bagans has operated in an unusual position of simultaneous subject and narrator. He investigates the story. He controls the footage, he edits the footage, he releases the footage on his own terms. And in the case of Demon House, he literally destroyed the primary physical artifact before independent verification was possible. This is not an accusation. It is a description of the structure within which his most significant claims have been made. Now, at 49, the accumulation of these choices is visible on him. If you watch interviews from 2010 and compare them to interviews from 2025, the change is not subtle. The younger Bagans was animated in a way that carried the energy of someone who believed he was on the edge of proving something historic. The older Bagans carries a different weight. He is still articulate. He is still precise. But there is something in him that has settled into a kind of permanent certainty that no longer requires external validation. He does not seem to be trying to convince anyone of anything anymore. He seems, instead, like a man who has long since stopped expecting the world to follow him where he has gone. He has spoken about his diet in interviews, describing an approach to food that prioritizes what he calls clean eating, with restrictions on alcohol and processed foods, that he connects directly to his belief that physical purity affects his capacity to perceive and interact with paranormal energy. He exercises regularly. He has described a sleep schedule that is deliberately structured around his work cycles, which often involve late-night filming sessions that push his body clock into patterns incompatible with conventional social life. He does not keep conventional hours because his work does not permit conventional hours. The lifestyle is total. His relationship with social media has been, by the standards of his industry, unusually controlled. He uses Instagram with consistent frequency, typically posting images related to the museum, new investigations, and personal reflections that maintain the same tonal register as his on-camera persona. He does not perform a separate, lighter version of himself online. The public Zach Bagans and the social media Zach Bagans are the same person. Whether that represents authenticity or an inability to code switch is a question his audience debates with remarkable intensity. The museum has, in recent years, become the most stable axis of his professional life. Ghost Adventures has continued, but the pace of production has slowed from the pace of peak years. The museum operates continuously, independently of filming schedules, and generates revenue from ticketed admissions in a way that does not require Bagans to be physically present or emotionally available on any particular day. It is his legacy project. It is the thing that will exist after the television cameras stop rolling, and it is, arguably, the truest expression of what he actually believes about the world. The museum contains over 30,000 square feet across multiple floors. It houses artifacts including the original diaries from the estate of Jack Kevorkian, whose work on physician-assisted death in the 1980s and 90s generated enormous public and legal controversy. It contains a custom-built car that belonged to Bruno Hauptmann, convicted of kidnapping and murdering the infant son of Charles Lindbergh in 1932. It contains materials connected to Ed Gein, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, and multiple other individuals whose names are synonymous with American violent crime history. It houses a significant collection of items connected to reported hauntings from across the United States and internationally. This is not a novelty collection. This is a carefully curated assemblage of objects connected to human suffering, violence, death, and the alleged persistence of negative energy. And Bagans lives in its orbit. He acquires new objects. He studies them. He sometimes films their arrival and their effect on him and his colleagues. He has built a physical monument to the darkest chapters of human experience, and he tends it daily. What does that do to a person over time? Not in the paranormal sense. In the purely psychological, purely neurological, purely human sense, what does decades of sustained focus on death, violence, trauma, and the spaces where those things occurred do to the architecture of someone's inner life? This is not a question that the Ghost Adventures franchise has ever fully sat with, because asking it too honestly would destabilize the entertainment premise. But it is the question that rises to the surface every time Bagans gives an unguarded interview, every time he describes the darkness he carries, every time he explains why he has built a life that keeps the rest of the world at a particular distance. His friendships appear to be few and deeply maintained. Aaron Goodwin, who has been a core member of the Ghost Adventures crew since the early seasons, remains one of his closest associates. The bond between them, documented across hundreds of hours of footage, shows something genuine underneath the theatrical frame. They have argued on camera. They have expressed fear on camera. They have, at various points, expressed what looks very much like real concern for each other in moments that the editing did not fully smooth over. Jay Wasley, who joined the crew as an audio technician in the mid-seasons and became a full investigator, is another sustained presence. Billy Tolley, who has worked with Bagans for over a decade, is another. These men do not simply work for Bagans. They share the specific psychological experience of doing this particular kind of work in these particular conditions, and that shared experience creates a kind of bond that is difficult to replicate in conventional social environments. But this is also part of the isolation. When your closest relationships are with the people who do your exact work, when the shared language of your social life is the language of your professional life, the barriers between self and role begin to dissolve. You stop being a person who does a job and you become a person who is the job. This is not unique to Bagans. It happens to soldiers, to surgeons, to law enforcement professionals who spend careers in violent environments. The difference is that most of those professions have institutional support structures, mandatory psychological evaluation, peer review, and collective professional standards. Ghost hunting, as a discipline, has none of those things. It operates entirely outside institutional frameworks. There is no licensing board. There is no professional oversight. There is no mandatory debriefing after a filming session in an asbestos-heavy building in the middle of the night. This has created a situation in which Zach Bagans, at 49 years old, is a man of genuine accomplishment, genuine influence, and genuine wealth, operating in a psychological landscape with very few guardrails and very few people positioned to offer him anything he has not specifically requested. His net worth has been estimated by multiple financial publications at between $5 and $10 million, with some estimates placing it higher based on the museum's continued growth and the licensing value of the Ghost Adventures catalog. He owns significant real estate in the Las Vegas area. He has production infrastructure. He has a brand that extends across merchandise, digital content, and the museum admission business. By conventional measures of American professional success, he has achieved something substantial. And by conventional measures of personal life, he has arrived at 49 without a partner, without children, with a lifestyle so singular and so consuming that the question of what comes next does not have an obvious answer. He has, in interviews, expressed something close to contentment with this arrangement. He has said that the work requires everything, and that giving everything to the work is what he chooses to do. He has framed the absence of conventional personal milestones not as loss, but as alignment with something he considers more important than those milestones. He believes he is doing necessary work. He believes that the documentation of paranormal phenomena, the preservation of haunted objects, the investigation of locations where dark history accumulated, serves some larger purpose that justifies the personal cost. Whether that belief is a genuine spiritual conviction or a coping mechanism built over decades of unusual choices is the kind of question that cannot be answered from outside. Probably both things are true simultaneously, in the way that most foundational human beliefs contain both sincere conviction and protective function in proportions that shift across time. What the headlines consistently miss about Zak Bagans at 49 is this: the story is not primarily about ghosts. It was never primarily about ghosts. The story is about a man who found a framework for existence in his early 20s, committed to it completely, built a life so thoroughly inside that framework that the framework and the life became indistinguishable, and is now experiencing the particular quality of midlife that comes from that kind of total commitment. Not regret, exactly. Not doubt, exactly. Something more specific and more difficult to name. The settled awareness of someone who has paid the price of their convictions and is living in the world that payment built. His body carries the record of his choices. His face, visible in interviews and social media appearances through 2025 and into 2026, shows the specific kind of aging that comes not from hardship exactly, but from intensity, from years of late nights in cold buildings, from the accumulation of adrenaline responses triggered repeatedly across decades, from the psychological weight of a worldview that places genuine malevolence at the center of the universe and positions the investigator as someone willingly standing at its edge. He has never walked away. That is perhaps the most remarkable thing. He has had every financial opportunity, every cultural opportunity, every practical opportunity to redirect towards something safer and softer. He has not taken any of them. The haunted museum is not the choice of a man who is winding down. It is the choice of a man who is going deeper. What is still open, what remains genuinely unanswered, is the question of cost. Not in dollars, in the currency of human experience. The friendships he did not form because the schedule would not allow them. The relationships that ended against the specific gravity of his singular focus. The versions of his life that closed as he walked further into the specific and demanding territory that defines everything he has made and everything he is. Those costs are real even if they are invisible in the footage, and they are the unspoken subject of every interview he has given in the last several years. What has been eliminated as possibility for Bagans is the conventional life. That door closed a long time ago, and he closed it deliberately. The question that is still open is whether the life he built in its place, the museum, the investigations, the mythology, the total identification with a mission that most of the world regards as at best eccentric and at worst delusional, whether that life provides the thing that all human lives require to be sustainable. Not fame, not money, not even purpose. Whether it provides enough genuine human connection to carry a person through the years ahead. At 49, Zak Bagans is still working. He is still filming. He is still acquiring objects, still walking into buildings that most people would not enter, still claiming to feel things that most people will never feel. The empire he built is real, and it is sustained by his continued presence at its center. The question is not whether the machine keeps running. The question is what the machine costs the man who is still feeding it. That question does not have an answer today, but it is the right question, and it is the one that the headlines, focused on the ghosts and the gadgets and the ratings numbers, have never quite managed to ask. Ghost Adventures ran for 26 seasons. Zak Bagans, Aaron Goodwin, Billy Tolley, and Jay Wasley built the most successful paranormal investigation franchise in television history. They went places nobody else would go. They stayed in buildings that broke people. They documented things that the scientific community refused to acknowledge and that millions of viewers could not explain away. Then, something shifted. Not suddenly, not cleanly, but in the way that things shift in lives built around extreme work and the specific psychological toll it carries across years of sustained exposure. By the time you finish this video, you will understand what really happened to the people behind Ghost Adventures after the cameras stopped defining their days. And what you discover is going to stay with you. The full story starts right now. Ghost Adventures was never supposed to become what it became. When Zach Bagans shot the original documentary in 2004, wandering through the abandoned halls of a reportedly haunted building in Goldfield, Nevada, with a consumer camcorder and the specific kind of fearless recklessness that only comes from having nothing to lose, he was not building a franchise. He was following an obsession. The documentary that resulted from that night was raw, unpolished, and entirely unlike the produced paranormal programming that the Travel Channel and its competitors were assembling from focus-grouped formats and talent agency rosters. It was real in the way that only footage shot by a person genuinely frightened and genuinely committed can be real. And when the Travel Channel saw it, they recognized something that no production meeting had generated and no development process had designed. They offered Bagans a series. What Ghost Adventures became across its first several seasons was something the paranormal television genre had not previously produced. Not a team of skeptics performatively debunking claims. Not a group of true believers whose enthusiasm substituted for methodology. A crew of genuine investigators whose individual relationships to the work were authentic, whose fear was real, whose connection to the locations they investigated went beyond the requirements of a production schedule, and whose chemistry as a unit created a viewing experience that no comparable show ever quite replicated. The locations they chose were not chosen for production convenience. Alcatraz, the Winchester Mystery House, Bobby Mackey's Music World, Eastern State Penitentiary, Poveglia Island, the Villisca Axe Murder House. These were places with documented histories of suffering, of violence, of deaths whose specific character the team researched and understood before they walked through the door. Zach Bagans approached every investigation as a personal mission. Aaron Goodwin brought a quality of genuine vulnerability that the audience recognized as unperformable. Billy Tolley arrived from a technical background that gave the show's equipment operation a credibility that legitimized the evidence the investigations produced. And Jay Wasley contributed an audio expertise whose professional foundation made the EVP work the show conducted more rigorous than anything comparable in the genre. Together, they produced 26 seasons of television across nearly 2 decades. The audience they built was not casual. These were viewers who watched episodes multiple times, who memorized location histories, who followed the cast members' individual lives with the kind of sustained attention that only genuine connection generates. Then the years began to show, and what they showed was not what the audience expected. Zach Bagans was born on April 3, 1977, in Washington, D.C. He grew up in Glendale, California, and later in the Detroit metropolitan area, a geography that shaped his aesthetic sensibility and his approach to darkness in ways that are visible in every creative decision he has made since. He was not a child who drifted toward the paranormal. He was drawn to it by a specific encounter he has described publicly on multiple occasions. A female apparition in the hallway of his Michigan apartment in 2002 that he has said produced in him not terror, but an absolute and consuming need to understand. That need became the engine of everything that followed. What the audience watched across 26 seasons of Ghost Adventures was Zach Bagans at the center of an investigation that was also, always, a deeply personal project. He was not a host reading scripts and hitting marks. He was a person genuinely seeking something: contact, confirmation, understanding. And the camera documented that seeking with an intimacy that the genre had not previously achieved at scale. His theatricality was real, and his fear was real, and his obsession was real. And the combination of those 3 things in a single person on camera across 2 decades produced something that no television format could have engineered deliberately. What the camera could not capture was the accumulation. 26 seasons of lockdowns in some of the most psychologically extreme environments that the concept of a haunted location has produced. Buildings where documented suffering soaked into the structure over decades or centuries. Locations associated with violence, abuse, death, and the specific residual quality that investigators believe those things leave behind. Zach Bagans spent the better part of 2 decades placing himself voluntarily into those environments, often overnight, often alone, always with the specific intention of making contact with whatever resided there. The psychological toll of that sustained exposure is not something that resolves itself between episodes. People close to Bagans have described changes that accumulated gradually and then were suddenly obvious. A withdrawal from the social ease that his earlier public persona projected. An intensity that became more consuming and less easily set aside when the production wrapped. Health issues that he has addressed partially in public statements, but whose full dimension his private circle understood more completely than his audience did. His obsession with death, documented in the haunted museum he built in Las Vegas and in the artifacts of suffering he has collected across his career, moved from an investigative framework into something that began to look, to those who knew him closely, more like a compulsion whose grip had tightened across the years, rather than loosening with familiarity. By the time Ghost Adventures reached its later seasons, Zach Bagans was a different person than the 27-year-old who carried a camcorder through the Goldfield Hotel. The distance between those two versions of the same man is the part of his story that the show's episode count does not convey, and that the audience who loved what he built deserves to understand. Aaron Goodwin was born on April 1st, 1977, in Portland, Oregon. He arrived at Ghost Adventures not as a paranormal investigator with a research background, but as a cameraman whose professional skill set was in visual documentation rather than supernatural inquiry. What he brought to the show that no job description could have predicted was a quality of authentic human response to extreme situations that became one of the most beloved elements of everything Ghost Adventures produced across its run. Aaron Goodwin's fear was not performed. When he screamed, the audience knew it. When he pushed himself through a building that his entire nervous system was telling him to leave, they felt that too. His emotional transparency in environments specifically designed by the production to produce maximum psychological stress gave the show a human center that Zach Bagans' intensity and the technical crew's professional composure could not have provided without him. He was the person the audience placed themselves inside when they watched. His fear was their fear. His willingness to stay was their inspiration. What the screen did not show was what those lockdowns cost him personally. Aaron has spoken in interviews across the years about the specific psychological weight of sustained paranormal investigation, the difficulty of sleeping after certain locations, the way particular encounters stayed with him in ways that the next production day did not erase, the challenge of maintaining the boundary between professional documentation of extreme experiences and the personal residue those experiences leave in the person who underwent them. For a man whose emotional transparency was the professional attribute the show most depended on, that boundary was structurally more difficult to maintain than it would have been for a more guarded personality. His personal life carried its own weight through the years of the show's production. A marriage that ended, relationships that the demands of a production schedule whose location shooting took him away from home for sustained periods made more difficult to sustain than they might otherwise have been. Financial questions that the specific economics of television production create for crew members whose income depends on a show's continuation, and the specific challenge of building an identity so completely around a single professional context that when the framework of that context changes, the question of who you are outside of it becomes genuinely difficult to answer. Aaron Goodwin built something real on Ghost Adventures. What it took from him in the building is the chapter of his story that the laugh track of his most famous moments was always drowning out. Billy Tolley came to Ghost Adventures from a background that was genuinely unusual for paranormal television. His technical expertise in audio and visual equipment gave the show's evidence collection a professional foundation that the genre needed and rarely had, and his quiet, steady presence behind the equipment gave the investigations a grounded quality that balanced the more emotionally volatile energies that the lockdown format reliably produced. He was not the face of the show in the way that Zach and Aaron were. He was something the show arguably needed more. The person who made sure that what happened in those buildings was actually documented rather than simply experienced. What Tolley brought to the investigations beyond his technical capability was a skeptical discipline that he rarely expressed loudly, but that shaped the quality of the evidence the show took seriously. He was not a true believer whose enthusiasm preceded his analysis. He was a technician who understood what his equipment could and could not confirm, and whose professional standards for what constituted documentable evidence were higher than the production format always required him to apply. That discipline created a private friction, the distance between what his professional judgment told him about a piece of evidence and what the show's narrative required that evidence to mean, that accumulated across seasons in ways the audience was not positioned to see. The years of production work that Ghost Adventures demanded of its technical crew were not the years of a comfortable professional life. Location shooting in structures that were physically deteriorating, in environments whose conditions, temperature, structural integrity, air quality in buildings that had been abandoned for decades, created real occupational health considerations that the show's entertainment framing made easy to overlook. Billy Tolley spent years in buildings that nobody else was in, doing work that required sustained concentration in conditions that were genuinely difficult for a production whose success depended on his expertise, while its public attention centered on the personalities his equipment was documenting. What that specific professional experience produces in a person over the course of 26 seasons is a story that the technical credits at the end of every episode were never designed to tell. Jay Wasley joined the Ghost Adventures crew as its audio specialist, a role whose technical demands were specific and whose contribution to the show's most significant evidence was foundational in ways that casual viewers rarely fully appreciated. Electronic voice phenomena, the audio recordings of sounds or apparent voices captured during investigations that cannot be attributed to any present source, were among the most compelling and most debated evidence Ghost Adventures produced across its run. The quality of that evidence depended entirely on the quality of the audio documentation behind it. Jay Wasley was the person responsible for that documentation. His professional background in audio engineering gave the show's EVP work a methodological rigor that distinguished its findings from the amateur recordings that the broader paranormal community produced, and whose technical foundation made the evidence the investigations captured harder for skeptics to dismiss on purely procedural ground. What audio work in paranormal investigation produces in the person doing it is something that the field rarely discusses openly, but that practitioners acknowledge privately. The process of listening, carefully, repeatedly, with professional attention, to audio recorded in buildings associated with violence and death, at hours when the human nervous system is least equipped to process extreme sensory input calmly, across seasons of sustained overnight investigation, creates a specific kind of accumulated exposure whose effects are not captured by any episode's closing credits. Jay Wasley spent years with headphones on in dark buildings, listening for things that were not supposed to be there, and finding them often enough that the act of listening became inseparable from the expectation of what would be heard. His personal navigation of the post-production years, the transition from a professional life organized entirely around the Ghost Adventures production framework to whatever came after it, carried dimensions that the public record of his career has addressed only partially. The question of professional identity after a role that specific and that sustained is not a simple one. The skills are real. The experience is real. The resume that Ghost Adventures built for everyone on the crew is genuine. But the psychological architecture that 2 decades of paranormal investigation builds in a person does not disassemble cleanly when the production schedule ends. And the specific challenges that architecture creates in the ordinary professional world that follows it are the part of Jay Wasley's story that his audio credits never prepared the audience to understand. There is a conversation about Ghost Adventures that the show's 26 seasons of episode content was structurally incapable of having. It is the conversation about what sustained paranormal investigation at the level the show demanded does to the people conducting it, not in the sensationalized terms that the format itself sometimes deployed. Possession claims, attachment theories, the suggestion that dark entities follow investigators home, but in the entirely documentable, entirely ordinary, entirely human terms of what happens to people who spend years voluntarily placing themselves in environments associated with extreme suffering and death, who do so in conditions of sleep deprivation and physical discomfort, who do so while maintaining a professional responsibility to document their responses honestly, and who do so while the commercial framework of a television production requires that those responses be compelling rather than simply truthful. Every member of the Ghost Adventures core crew has spoken at various points about the psychological cost of the work, the sleep disruption that follows certain investigations, the difficulty of returning to ordinary life after certain locations, the specific challenge of relationships maintained alongside a production schedule that takes you away from home and places you in extreme circumstances and then requires you to be present and functional for the next one. These are not supernatural claims. They are the entirely ordinary psychological consequences of extraordinary professional exposure, and they are the context without which the specific ways that each member of this cast has navigated the years since the show's peak cannot be understood. Zach Bagans built a museum dedicated to objects associated with death and suffering and spends his private hours in its company. Aaron Goodwin has navigated personal losses and relationship challenges whose specific character the production years shaped. Billy Tolley spent decades as the invisible, technical foundation of a show whose public identity never quite centered on his contribution. Jay Wasley listened for voices in the dark across seasons of investigation whose cumulative effect on a person who takes that work seriously is not a thing that resolves itself tidily. These are 4 people who gave Ghost Adventures everything it asked of them, across more seasons and more years than the genre had ever previously demanded of a stable core crew. What the show gave back, and what it could not give back, and what each of them has been navigating in its absence, is the complete story of what happened to the cast of Ghost Adventures. And it is more human, more complicated, and more heartbreaking than any episode of the show itself ever managed to be. The Zak Bagans Haunted Museum in Las Vegas is one of the most unusual institutions that paranormal television has ever produced as a cultural artifact. It is not a merchandise store. It is not a themed experience built around a show's brand for extracting secondary revenue from an established audience. It is a collection Bagans assembled over decades of personal acquisition, organized around objects he and others believe carry residual energy from the violence, suffering, and death associated with their histories. The Dybbuk Box, a staircase removed from the Demon House in Gary, Indiana, a property he purchased and demolished after documenting what he believed was an active demonic infestation. Items connected to serial killers, documented deaths, and historical tragedies whose physical residue he sought out and brought under one roof in the middle of the Las Vegas Strip. What the museum reveals about Zak Bagans at this stage of his life is more significant than anything it reveals about the objects it contains. A person who builds a structure like that and inhabits it, who surrounds himself with objects whose histories are defined entirely by suffering, who continues acquiring and engaging with that material after 26 seasons of investigation have already produced whatever answers they were going to produce, is a person in whom the original obsession has not diminished with exposure. It has deepened. The museum is an achievement. It is also a monument to something that the person who built it cannot set down. And that inability, that quality of being held by something across decades and through everything those decades produced, is the most heartbreaking element of his story, and the one his audience is least positioned to recognize as the cost that it is. Aaron Goodwin's most difficult years came not during the production of Ghost Adventures, but after it began to wind down from its peak. The professional identity he had built was so completely associated with the show, with being the person whose fear was the audience's permission to feel afraid, that the question of who Aaron Goodwin was outside that context was one he had not been given much opportunity to explore across 2 decades of continuous production. Working out the answer has been a process rather than a revelation. He has spoken about faith as an anchor through difficult periods. He has spoken about the gap between the version of yourself that a production format shapes and the person navigating ordinary life off camera. He has done all of this publicly, with the vulnerability that his Ghost Adventures persona established as his default mode of engagement, which means the people who loved him have watched his harder chapters in full view. A closeness that has been both support and pressure simultaneously. The thing about Aaron Goodwin that Ghost Adventures always communicated but never quite said is that his openness is not a performance. It is the actual texture of who he is. That quality built something rare with his audience. It also means the difficult years were not managed behind a composed public face. They were navigated honestly, in the open, in the way that someone who has never learned to be anything other than truthful navigates things. Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley occupied the position the genre produces most invisibly. The indispensable professionals whose expertise made the show's most significant evidence possible, and whose contribution the broadcast format consistently under-acknowledged. Tolley spent decades ensuring that what happened in those buildings was documented rather than simply experienced. Wasley spent years listening for things that were not supposed to be there, in conditions whose cumulative effect on a person who takes that work seriously is not something that resolves tidily when production ends. Both men built professional identities entirely inside the Ghost Adventures framework, which means the question of who they are outside that framework is the same difficult question every long-term crew member faces when the defining production of their career is finished. What the show gave back was real. What it could not give back is the version of each of them that existed before it began. The cast of Ghost Adventures is not gone. Zak Bagans continues to investigate, to acquire, to push himself into environments that most people would not enter on a dare. Aaron Goodwin continues to engage with the audience he built, with the openness that made them love him in the first place. Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley carry forward the expertise of 2 decades of work that the genre will not see replicated at that level again. But the version of Ghost Adventures that existed in its peak seasons is finished. It finished not because of a single decision, but because of the accumulation that is the subject of this video. Because 26 seasons of extreme work in extreme environments leaves the people who do it changed in ways the production format documents only incompletely. Because the specific chemistry that made those four people produce what they produced cannot be refreshed indefinitely without cost. And because that cost, distributed across Zach Bagans and Aaron Goodwin and Billy Tolley and Jay Wasley in their different ways, is the real story of what happened to the cast of Ghost Adventures. It is heartbreaking because it is honest. And it is honest because these were people who were always, across 26 seasons, trying to tell the truth about what they found. If you want to stay ahead of every story like this one, subscribe now and turn your notifications on.